And welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 235. Today we're going to be looking at the notion of removing objects from photos. There's a number of different ways you can do it. Primarily I'm going to be using Photoshop, but there are plenty of other tools out there. So that's pretty much what we're going to be dealing with. Let's make a start. Yeah, so welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 235. So, yes, it was supposed to just be a feedback session today, but while I was sort of searching through, Marilyn from Colorado sent me through a request about... Well, she said she was having sort of problems with working out whether to use the clone tool or the remove tool or all these sorts of things. And got me starting to think about the notion that when you want to remove something in Photoshop, there's generally about at least a dozen different ways you can do it. So I thought I would kind of concentrate on the main ones to help her sort out a particular picture she was doing. And then when I started thinking about that, I thought this is probably quite useful information for anybody who's editing their photos. So whether you're using, like I said, I'm going to be concentrating on Photoshop because that's the one I've got. Even if you don't have Photoshop, some of the same principles might apply to you with other editing programs you're using, or even what you're using on your phone. So that's really kind of what I'm going to be talking about today. Meanwhile, we are here live on YouTube. If you happen to be watching live, then leave a comment in the chat box. Let me know you're here. Let me know where you're from. Let me know what the weather's doing. All the usual kind of stuff, and we can get chatting. And meanwhile, don't forget to like the video and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Invite your friends. All the usual kind of stuff which might help grow this wonderful community of ours. Meanwhile, I see we've got a few people in already, so... let's see where we're at. So April joins us, says, greeting from a dreary Long Island, New York. Janet says, hi from a chilly Mississauga, but the temperature is going to be all over the place this coming week. Highs of 13 degrees C, but then 3 degrees C, and then 18 degrees C, and then 10 degrees C. It's going to be, yeah, you're right, it is going to be all over the place. John says, hello from a wet Ohio. Susan says, hello from a lovely sunny day in Kakubri. Wish I could give you some more of our sunshine, April. And here in Castle Douglas, I have to say, it is beautifully sunny as well, which is just 9 miles along the road from Kakubri. Absolutely clear blue skies. It's about 12 degrees, 11 degrees, something like that Celsius. So it's there is a bit of a nip in the air. When you're in the direct sun, it's really quite nice. But if you happen to be sort of just in the shade where there's a bit of a wind blowing, it's still kind of slightly biting cold. Oh, Stacey joins us. Says, good morning, everyone. It's cloudy here, but warming up in Hatboro, Pennsylvania. Been very busy trying to finish things and organise for our wedding. Oh, well, congratulations, Stacey. That's wonderful. Marilyn says, hello from a snowy Colorado. April says, we had a beautiful day yesterday, 77 degrees. Well, that's Fahrenheit, obviously, not Celsius. Busy frying away if that was Celsius. And Nick's joined us from a sunny Bath down in the West Country. And it is Bath West Country. I'm never quite sure. I used to live down in Devon, which definitely was West Country. So Bath seemed a bit kind of north and out of the West Country to me. But I often hear it said as such. How would you describe it, Nick? But anyway, basically Southwest England is where Nick is based. So what are we doing then here? So yes, today, quick, before we do anything else, quick update on Smug Points. So Smug Points you get if you are contributing to these podcasts. So if you are here watching live now and you haven't yet written anything in, if you're just lurking but not saying anything, but if you actually say anything, you type anything in, let me know. You get an automatic 5 Smug Points for turning up and saying hi and being here live. If you contribute to the challenges, you get 10 Smug Points. If you put in an image for critique or feedback, you get 25 Smug Points. So Marilyn will be getting 25 today, as will Viji, because she put in an image in today as well. So there's plenty of ways you can get the Smug Points. Where are we? So for March then, we're currently, before we get to the end of today, Robert is sitting there, Robert from Texas, at 75 Smug Points, and that's primarily because he was the winner of the challenge last week. Viji is running a close second with 65 Smug Points, Nadia is at 55, Janet is at 50. But like I say, this will all shuffle around a bit by the time we get to the end of this podcast. Right, okay, so let's, what are we going to do? Oh, so what's Stacey saying? Oh, Stacey's saying it's 80 degrees there, right? Oh, okay, so, where am I? Let me find a picture. And let's make a little start here. And oh, not that one. Yes, right, okay, so this podcast has started off out of this. Marilyn sent me this image. Well, this is her unedited image. And this was the edited version, cropped in, a couple of people missing from it, or removed from it. But this is the original photo. And she said, my biggest problem right now is using the remove and the clone tools. Remove mostly does a good job, but when it doesn't, I can make a mess of it with the clone and eventually give up. On the attached photo, I wanted to remove all the people. By cropping and removing, I did succeed with most. However, it didn't work that well with a final group of people. I know there's a lot of trained technical detail behind the people. I even considered putting bushes in the area where the people were, but my skills are certainly lacking. And so, yes, so we have this picture. We've got this wonderful steam train. We've got this kind of big silo thing going on in the background. Quite an interesting shot of the dry grass, the blue sky. But yes, we've got cables hanging down, and we've got loads of people standing there, all taking photos and looking at it. And that woman even there looks like she's waving. We've even got pet dogs. So there's a lot of stuff in the way, and if you don't want it, now it's one thing if you're doing a photo where your photo is the idea that you're documenting the idea of here's a train and here's lots of people taking photos of it. But if you don't want the people in the way, what are you left with? And here we kind of come across quite an interesting idea in a way with photography anyway, which is at the point you start removing things from a photo that wasn't there, how far have you removed from the idea of photography? Now, it's getting just slightly kind of philosophical here, but actually you can end up in these kind of arguments and debates. There are every year, whenever I do, every time I do an exhibition or I do anything where I kind of meet the public and I have photographers come round, sooner or later I will get someone who is would like to call themselves an in-camera photographer. And what they mean by that is that they never learned to edit. Now, that's a rather sweeping judging statement, and there are, of course, exceptions to that. But by and large, what they tend to mean is that, and it's maybe a slightly more important point on this, which is that if you, sorry, I'm just realising, let's just tilt that. No, not that way a little bit, and let's get Woody in the background there. Suddenly realising I'm not fully on screen, I think. But by and large, what we're talking about is the idea that photography is light hitting a sensor. Now, originally it used to be hitting a glass plate covered in silver nitrate, then it became hitting a film, with again coatings on it, and now it's hitting digital sensors. But that's what photography is: photo, light, graphos, mark making. So light making marks onto something. But then what do? Well, then there's editing, and editing is then making changes to what happened when the light hit the sensor. Now, generally speaking, in photography, we expect there to be editing, except for, unless you kind of feel like you are some kind of purist who shouldn't be editing. And so it's an interesting debate, and I can be a bit dismissive of people who, like I say, who call themselves in-camera photographers. Because by and large, I come at photography with the idea of photography as a storytelling medium. And as a storytelling medium, what I'm trying to do is convey a story. So there's limitations with the tool that I have. Even the best camera in the world maybe can't cope with the light and the dark that I want. Or maybe there's elements in a picture that kind of distract from the story I'm trying to tell. So therefore, I see my photography as almost like the kind of first draft. When I go click, it's the first draft of what I'm going to do, and then the editing helps me polish it up. And my argument has always been, it's a little bit like if you consider poetry. Would you say that the first draft that comes out of your head is the most authentic version of a poem? No. Any poet will tell you the first draft that comes out of their head tends to be a bit of a mess, but it's a guideline as to where they want to go, and then they hone it and they refine it, and eventually they end up with the poem that they want. Same with any form of writing. Same then with something like painting. Very rarely do you ever will any painter just sort of put the paint straight onto the canvas without any thoughts. They will move it, they will edit it, they will change it until they get the effect that they're wanting. As such, that notion of creativity, that the editing, the adjustments are just as much a part of the creativity as the original formulation as such. And so this is where I'm kind of coming at it with photography. Now, maybe all of you are already on board with this anyway, but it is something that I still tend to think is worth saying, because it also, I'm not going to go into the big AI debate at the moment, but it sort of overlaps. Because once we start getting into our editing where, okay, we're using clone tools, we're using tools to cover up one part of the picture, that's one thing. But what if we're using generative fill? What if we are using the remove tool where we are asking the computer to assist in the removing of particular objects or the replacement of particular objects? Well, at that point, we are using an artificial intelligence. We are using the computer to make these decisions for us, and quite often it will do it in a better way than we can. So how far along do you go with a photo, be changing this, adding that, before you actually go, this is no longer a real photo, and actually the majority of it, or what percentage of it, is then artificially added by using the computer? And essentially, as with all these things, different people will draw their line in different places. So at some point, I think I might even just dedicate a podcast specifically to the notion of AI and this debate. If anybody's interested in that, let me know, and I'll maybe play around with it. Anyway, so a couple more comments here. Let's just get. Oh, Nick comes back. It's Bath and North East Somerset, but for some reason we've always called it the West Country. Yeah, so it kind of forms into that sort of southwest England. Oh, Viji's joined us. It says, good evening, everyone, where Stacey says good morning, because, of course, Viji is in Chennai, which is roughly about 4.5 hours ahead of here we are in the UK, and Stacey's in Pennsylvania, which I think is 6 hours behind, something like that. So there's a good 10 hours or something between Stacey and Viji. April says, Bob Ross can do that. Amazing. Not sure. I'm missing some reference there who Bob Ross is and what you're doing about. You might need to fill me on the details with that one. Oh, Robert's joined us. Says howdy. All sunny and mild in North Texas. Viji saying hi. Well, Marilyn says yes. There's a podcast that would be interesting. AI is definitely here. Okay, well that's something to maybe we're going to kind of overlap slightly on with this picture. So let's move on then to this notion of. So, Nick reckons an AI podcast would be good as well. Okay, I will definitely keep this in mind then, and maybe it's something I'll bring up in the next month or two. So we go back to this notion then. So I showed you the picture that Marilyn had, and she was wanting to sort of try and edit out people, but there was so much detail behind it. It was creating this kind of tricky element, trickiness to it, because in the end we're not removing something, we're putting something over the top of what was there. It's like if you think, we're painting over the top of a person rather than removing them, because it's a flat image. We don't got no, if the light behind the person didn't hit the sensor, we have no idea what was actually there, so we make a guess as to what was there. Now I think, to be honest, I think the easiest thing to do to start here is I'm going to use a different picture, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to run you through various tools and how they work in Photoshop. So if let me go up to, let me just change my workspace here, remove that, and then open that, and then I will flip over here. So what I'm going to do here is I've opened up Photoshop. And what I'm using here is, some of you may remember this photo, which a still life study created in the style of the kind of Dutch old masters. And it was something I did for the podcast about, I don't know, three and a half years ago. But it's a useful one to start showing you what tools we have. Because supposing then what we have is we have this picture, and supposing we want to make adjustments to it. Now, at the time I'm taking the photo, I can make adjustments. I can move the pear slightly to the left. I can shift the knife slightly to the right and what have you. But if I want to make adjustments now, I have to go, I need to do it on the computer, because I'm not going to be able to recreate this exact photo. Even if I set up the table and I got in the same fruit, the fruit is going to be slightly different. The curve on the tip of the pear won't be identical, the grapes won't be identical, nothing will be absolutely identical. So if I want to make edits, then I need to change and move things about. So what I want to talk about then is that we have a number of little elements, little tools at our disposal to make changes. So let's say I've got a knife over here, and let's say I want to remove that knife. Now, what I have is I have various little patches of things I can do. I can use a spot healing tool. Now, generally speaking, a spot healing tool is better for small things. But what I can do is if I essentially paint over that and then release, you can see it's gone, except for the fact it's kind of left a bit of a smudgy mark there. It's not absolutely brilliant, but it's not bad, but for bigger things it doesn't tend to work so well. Where this works is if you're wanting to remove tiny things. So say I wanted to remove the little glow on the tip of the candle here. If I do that, that's worked much better. Now we've still got the smoke there, so I'll maybe need to remove the smoke. But just removing a bit of candle, that's actually worked quite well. Tell you what, I'll do this on a separate layer. Whereas if I want to remove the lid of this, how's that going to do? Not quite so good. What it's done is, you see, so the spot tool, what it's doing is it's kind of looking at the pixels that are around the outside of the brush, and then it's deciding to fill the middle of that space with what's related to the outside. And by taking, it's related the outside, the texture at the back here, but it's dragged it over the top of the coffee pot. So that doesn't really work so well. Whereas if I want to remove, say, where can I find something like the tip of this, if I run that down, now that's rather good, because it's actually, I'm staying on the cloth, it's actually just removing the bit, it's painting bits of the cloth over the top of it. But like I say, as soon as I kind of run across something and I do that, it's not really quite sure what to do. So the spot tool, the spot healing brush tool, this is what this is good for. This is good for sort of really removing spots. So again, we might decide that, oh look, there's a little mark on the thing there, I do that, well, brilliant, it's just gone. Okay, so that's your kind of your starting point. And in a way, okay, maybe what I should do is let's go to the clone tool, because the clone tool is really where it all started. The rubber stamp, clone stamp tool. Now what the clone stamp tool does is it allows you to copy one part of the picture and paint it onto another part. So if I, for example, well, let's just say I press down my Alt key here, click on there, and then I can start. You see, wherever I move here is copying in direct proportion. So it keeps it going. So now that's fine if I want to, but if I place a candle over here, but of course it's looking a bit wrong and it's not really, well, what's the point of doing that? But supposing I wanted to have a second knife, then what I might do is just lightly clone in that. Now it's cloned the knife, but it's also kind of cloning the other bits of background. And if I go over far enough, you see it starts cloning a third knife, and maybe I don't want that. But it's now kind of got a bit up here. So it's not always ideal. And depending on what you're cloning it onto, you've got to bear in mind the background. The background might not be the same to place it on. We have different colours, we have different shades, and we have all sorts of different bits. So you kind of see what I mean. So the clone tool is kind of the starting point. So if I wanted to get rid of this smoke, what I might do is clone this bit of cloth and then paint it over the top. Now you can see here where I didn't line it up, so it's actually hitting the top of the, let's go back here, let's just do it from slightly underneath, and I can do that, and I can paint over the top of, and if I want I can come down. I've got to be careful here because I then start cloning that bit as well. So I can use, so the original, you can use, the original thing is the clone tool, but the clone isn't always brilliant because, as we can see, we've got lots of different kind of shades and patterns on here, and if I click here and start cloning it, suddenly we end up with a slightly different piece of cloth. So the fact that where we're maybe trying to grab a piece of cloth from, now here there's plenty of cloths to choose from, but there isn't always, you know, if we're down here, there's not a lot of cloth to choose from if we wanted to start filling in gaps there. Okay, got to be careful here, kind of want to try and narrow it down, stop waffling on quite so much. The point being is that the clone tool could be really useful for some things, but it doesn't always get in. Sometimes for little things, the spot healing tool works better. So we've got our spot healing tool, we've got our clone tool. Now there's another tool, actually I'll tell you what, let's just pause for a moment while I, yes, a couple of comments here. Okay, people talking about Bob Ross. Oh yes, he was an artist on TV. Oh, he'd paint on the spot. He'd paint on the spot with no mistakes. But what he did was he did a lot of practice beforehand. He would have practiced with every picture that he painted. He will have done 20 versions of before he does it live in front of the cameras. Anyway, it's a bit of a chat there about Bob Ross. Where are we? So Nick says, do you think it's like dodge and burn in film photography? We use our hands or bits of card for more shadow or even hide bits to have more light or darker areas of print. Oh, Meg's Justin says hello everyone. Nick also says some people stack negatives together to create all the images together. Yeah, absolutely. We're talking back to this idea of editing. Is editing, you know, how much is cheating, how much is creativity? I used to know a photographer friend who worked back in the analog days, and he said he used to get into arguments with the guy who would print the photos, who said 90% of the photography actually happens in the darkroom. That there's this creativity that goes on in the editing process. But it essentially, I think, is just understanding that they are two different skills. We're using them in the same way, but there's the photographic skill, which is what you're seeing at the moment of taking the image. There's the point whereby you are choosing where the boundaries of the camera are. You're adjusting the light and exposure settings. You're dealing with the technical information, the compositional, working out where the light's coming from. You've got that with what's going to be hitting. You're making all the decisions of how the light is going to be, how much light and where the light is going to be hitting onto the sensor. Once you've got that picture, then there's the editing process, which is a second, it's a second process. It's a different process. And editing an image isn't the same as taking the image. So then editing the image is another form of creativity. So then you're deciding which bits need to be lighter, which bits need to be darker, which bits you want to remove, which bits you want to enhance. And people got very, very sophisticated in the darkroom. Some people even painting negatives, airbrushing was an old technique in developing film. So, you know, even go back to glass paints, and people were painting onto the glass paint, you know, onto the glass plates in order to create particular negatives and all the rest of it. So that notion of editing has been around forever. What Photoshop allows us to do is to do it without worrying about chemicals, and also we have that wonderful Control Z. We have the undo button. Whereas if you make a mess up when you're in the dark room and you're doing all the printing, you have to start all over again. So okay, where was I? So far, yes. So what I've shown you then is the idea of the clone tool, the spot removal. There is then another tool that you can use, which is the patch tool. Now the patch tool kind of works a bit like the spot healing, and generally it's usually in the same place. So I use the patch tool, and what it does is it looks at what's around the edge. But the thing is rather than it just being a little round spot, you can create a shape. So I can create a shape like that. Now that's just a patch tool, but I can drag another bit into it. Or I can say, take the patch of smoke there, and I can take another bit out of it. Now, the great thing about the patch tool is what it does is it kind of, so if I look at this, I decided I wanted to remove the smoke from here. I can take this and I can drag it over, and even if I take it into a brighter patch of cloth here, when I let go, it merges, it takes the texture of where I've come from, but it looks at the colour scheme that's around as well. So in fact, we've gone from, this now looks much better than if I'd cloned from over here. So the patch tool then could be really quite useful for getting rid of or removing larger chunks of bit. However, because it takes a chunk from around it, it doesn't always give you the best option. So say I wanted to get rid of this pear. If I kind of circle it like that and then drag it up to there, we can see it's not done very well at all. I've used a different kind of, it's got a different texture, it's got a different background, and also the colour from this apple is now giving us a bit of green over here. So it isn't necessarily the best tool to use. Again, supposing I wanted to, my thought was, let's get rid of this apple. So I circle this apple, and then I think, right, I want to replace it with a bit of textured cloth. So I drag it down to textured cloth like that. But you can see here now what we end up with is quite a mess, because it's grabbing the colour at the edge of the lemon here. It's got bits of the bowl behind it. It's got, so the colours aren't right. So the patch isn't going to work very well with that. The patch works best when you are replacing it with a piece of texture related to the one that you're trying to replace it with. Over here, if I wanted to get rid of this knife, actually I could probably, the patch tool might be quite good for that. Now the problem I've got here is if I come over here, if I go over too far, we can see part of the knife is coming in because I've hit the edge of the photo. So I then have to kind of find just enough of the right space, and it's not quite, the texture's a little bit different. It's not quite got it right. So the patch tool isn't necessarily giving me everything I want. And if I just decide, well, I'll just do that bit of the handle first, we can see that the yellow starts to come in. So depending on what you're trying to do, sometimes the clone tool will work, sometimes the spot healing, and sometimes the patch will do. Okay, but then there's another bit, the real latest bit of Photoshop, where the advance has been really happening in the last year or two, is in the remove tool and in the generative fill. So the next thing we have then is we have a remove tool. And if I click remove, what this does is it uses a little bit more intelligence. So let's say I grab this and I decide I'm going to remove this candle. So I come down here and I just paint this over the top of the candle like that. And now what it does is it sort of works out what else happens to be, you can see coming up, removing area. It's having a think about it. And now you see that's not bad at all. It noticed that there was this part of this handle behind, and it's joined it up. It noticed that there was a bit of a handle coming down here, and it's put one in. So actually that's not bad. However, it doesn't always necessarily work. If I decide that I want to use the remove tool on this apple, and I come down here, let's see what that will do. So I'll just paint that in. You take your finger off, and then you have to leave it a few seconds while it decides, okay, yep, you finished selecting. Actually, that's done much better than I thought it was. It's got a little bit of peel coming down here, but the peel has kind of gone a bit funny. It's not exactly, but I'm actually quite impressed. I did a version of this earlier, and all it did was replace it with something else. I think if I did that pear, let's just sort of see what happens with that. Is that going to remove it? Last time I tried it, actually just replaced it with an apple. Yeah, it's actually just replaced it with another pear. So, so that's not really doing much good. So in some ways, what the removal tool is noticing this other fruit and then sticking a fruit in it. So it's kind of got its limitations as well with the remove tool. So your ultimate place to go now is what's become the generative fill, so if I now click on this tool here, and this tool is, it's a selection brush tool. So let's say I decide to, we'll take this apple. I'll just paint in that apple there. And now what I can do is I've got a little box down here. If I click Generative Fill, and now I've got this box and I can fill in. Now, if I just leave it as is and hit generate, what it will do, I haven't given it any instruction, it's going to look at the rest of the picture and find something to stick into that shape, into that hole. And what its chances are, what it'll probably do is stick another apple. But let's take a look. Oh, well, it's actually stuck a lemon. But it's also given me options here. In here it's stuck a kind of a dried out orange or something. Here it's stuck a very different kind of apple. So it's decided, yes, there's fruit there, and it's given me fruit selections. Supposing though that isn't necessarily what I want. What I could do is I could just type, now I can either type it into this box down here, or I've got another box up here. So if I just type remove and see if it will actually take it out completely. Because this is kind of, the thing is with this is this connects up to the internet, and all the big heavy work is going on back at Microsoft. So, okay, what's it giving me now? Kind of papaya here or something like that, another apple. Okay, so that hasn't really given me the space. It hasn't given me what I wanted. Maybe I have to give it a slightly better instructions. Remove fruit, replace with tablecloth. Who knows? So it might work, it might not, or it might turn out that I'm going to have to start using a combination of different tools here. No, it's still absolutely insisting on giving me other bits of fruit. Now, well, that's interesting. It's taken the lemon and sort of then turned it into something else. So, okay, let's go with here. That's got rid of a chunk of it. So now what if I just want to get rid of that bit? So sometimes what you do is it gives you a starting point and then you kind of carry on. So now I'll try remove with that and see if it will just get rid of that tail end of the lemon peel. Alternatively, maybe at this point some of the other ones might start coming into play. Oh, it's given me another bit there, another bit there. Oh, there we go. I've got an option. Now, so the great thing about the generative fill is it gives you 3 options. And if you don't like it, you can just hit generate again. If it keeps coming up with the same kind of thing all the time, maybe you then need to change your selection area or give it a different set of instructions. But now you can see we've managed to finally, through 2 iterations, oh, there we go, we've managed to get rid of the apple that we had. So at this point though, it is painting in, that whole base of, if you look here, there is no base of the metal dish. We come here, it's created a metal dish for us, a stand for us, and it's in keeping with the other bits. So the interpretation is quite astonishing, but it doesn't always interpret the way we want it to. So we still have to be creative, we have to be instructional, we have to work out what we're going to do to get it to create and change in the way that we want to. So in essence, those are our tools. Now there's one last thing I will say about the generative fill, which you have to be careful of, and that is to do with resolution. That the generative fill, as it stands at the moment, at the end of March 2025, tends to be a much lower resolution. Now, if you don't have a very big picture to begin with, it doesn't really matter. But this is quite a high resolution size image. So let me just show you what we can do. I can do a generative expand here. And it's supposing I decided I wanted a bigger table and I wanted to stretch out this cloth a bit more like that. So I can just hit that, and now what it's going to do is it's going to work out what the rest of the picture is and then give something sympathetic to fill in where I've currently got a white gap. And again, it will give me 3 different brushes. So look at this, it's actually taken the cloth and it's given a lace around the edge. Or I've got this version where the cloth goes further out and it's given me a fold in the material behind. In this one, it's taken the cloth further down with a bit of shadow. So they're all interesting additions. Which, and I can now decide which one of these I want, whether I want to go again or whether I want to just change part of it. Let's say we go to this where it's given a lacy edge to it though. Now what I want to show you is as I come in, there comes a point whereby we have a sudden noticeable difference in quality. So here's the original photo, so we can see the tiny little bits of weave that have gone into the tablecloth because this is a high resolution. But as soon as we get into the fill, this is blurred. This is just, we do not have the same amount of detail. And so now, if I've got it back at this level, which is, and certainly as it's appearing on your screens, I can't tell the difference. There's enough there to make it look like it's, but if we came to print this out, it will be incredibly noticeable that there will be this almost cut-off line where you've got high resolution, low resolution. So generative fill, by and large, is really good for low resolution images or small patches where you're not doing anything more than a couple of 100 pixels wide. That's where it works at its best. Otherwise, if you're using large chunks, you can run into problems with that. Okay, so I hope that's all kind of making sense. What have we got else here? Jeffrey's joined us, says good morning / afternoon. Nick says technology is amazing, a little scary too. Well, yeah, I think it kind of can be scary, but then by and large, I think, what's that? April says this is a shame. It looks good, but the latest technology is not there yet with this. Yeah, well, that notion of technology is scary though. I think mostly for the most part, as we get older, technology becomes more and more scary. There's a lovely quote, I'm not going to be able to say it exactly, but I think it was Douglas Adams, who wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, who said something along the lines of, any technology that's around at the time we're born, we take absolutely for granted. So most of us watching this, for example, take television completely for granted, whereas perhaps our parents' generation, who grew up without television until the coronation when somebody on their street got one or something, back in the 50s, then suddenly they still kind of, television was a bit magical. But for them, radio was perfectly ordinary, whereas their parents, radio was something of a new technology. So anything technology you're born with, you take perfectly for granted. There's nothing special about it. It's ordinary, it's everyday. Then there's that notion that any technology that comes in when you're about 15 to about the age of 30 is like, oh wow, this is just amazing, this is so cool, I wonder if I could get a job doing this. And so for me and my generation, things like the internet with that, and yes, lo and behold, I actually set up as a web designer when I was in by the time I got to 30. I found, and the computer generation, and this was a kind of exciting time. But then any technology that comes up after you're about 45 is the work of the devil and should never have been invented. And we get more curmudgeonly about this. And every time I think I've just got the hang of a technology, they go and change it. And you start thinking about things like music. When we started growing up, it was vinyl and LPs. And then we got cassettes and tape, and that was great. And then mini discs came out. Then CDs came out. And CDs, so we transferred all our music, we've now got our music on CDs. And then mini discs came out, and some of us got mini discs, and then that went obsolete quite quickly, and then it became downloading and streaming, and but before you know it, now we live in a totally different world, and everything's fed to us in playlists and streaming, and there's a little movement for people going back to vinyl, but it's still pretty niche. It's never going to be as mainstream as streaming. So technology is moving, and actually, to be honest, I get fed up with it. I get fed up with every time I want to do something, there's now a new way of doing it. And that's to do with my age. I'm fill my brain with so many different things, I get fed up with learning new things, unless it's something which particularly excites me. So photography, I'm fine, I keep going with it. The developments in AI and editing, I'm fine with, because I'm doing it all the time. But so the new technology is either an opportunity or something scary that we don't want to go to. And that's going to depend very much on your own particular mindset, probably your age and your experiences as well. So interesting point though, Nick. Yes, April's point about whether the technology with the lace looked good but it's not there yet, I think it's purely a matter of time before it starts going much higher resolution. Jeffrey says technology is not scary. It leads to I think it leads to lazy if we let it. If we know we can change everything in post, why care about the original? Well, we can change everything in post, or we can. But to be honest, what I always say about photography is you get the best you can in camera, because then it gives you more options in post. If your photo, photos that I've taken where I've really struggled to get the photo, the ISO is really high, it's a very noisy picture, there's elements in it that I didn't really want it, then it's a lot of work in post, and it's a lot of work just to get it up to be a usable picture. Whereas if I get a really good picture to start with, then that expands greatly what I can do in post-production. So I think there's that notion of we're trying to improve our photography skills so that we have a better starting point for then what we can do with the editing. But I get your point about the idea of it can kind of create lazy shooting, but I think that only really happens for people who aren't really that interested in shooting in the first place. I think if you are really into your photography, you're always trying to expand and grow and master your photography. Okay. Now I've talked you through some of the different tools. Hopefully, Marilyn, you're seeing this. So let's go and put this into a specific. Let's go back to Marilyn's picture and open it up and see which ones we can use to get the effect we want. So where was it? Sorry, I've lost the picture now. So let's go back to Marilyn's original photo and we'll open it up in here. So what Marilyn did to begin with was just to get rid of the pole and these people over here. She cropped it in. So she started off with a crop like that, I think, more or less. And that also got rid of that top pile of wires. But we're already feeling kind of restricted. But in an ideal world, let's try and get rid of some of these things beforehand, and then we can decide whether we want to use the same edit or whether we've got more options with how we decide to crop it. Now, there is another tool at this point that has come into Photoshop fairly recently, which is remove distractions. Now, if I click on here, so we are into the selection brush tool, but when I've clicked, the one above that, the remove tool, and when I click on the remove tool, up here, there's another little thing which says find distractions, which is an interesting one. One-click removal. And it gives me options of wires and cables or people. So if I click on wires and cables, it's now going to look out for where the wires and cables are. Now, bear in mind, before we might have had to clone another piece of sky or use a patch of sky to go over the top of these things. And boom, just like that, it's gone. Okay, so the wires and cables are gone. Even where it was crossing these bits. Now, it's changed that little bit of chimney there, but I think we can live with that. Nobody's really going to notice. Now, it's left us with the pole, but it has immediately got rid of that. Now, what I might do with the pole is I might actually, let's go to the spot healing tool and see if that actually gets rid of, well, first of all, I think if I came down to there like that, yep, that's got rid of it, kept it in with the sky. Now, I've got to be careful here because there's a bit of train behind. So if I take this and I just run that down with the pole like that. Now you see where the problem comes is it's now copied some of this bit around it. So that one isn't going to work for that half. But what I can do though is I can at least do it, say, to there. Take it where there's definitely just sky behind. And I can remove that bit. So now I've just got a chunk. And sometimes what you want to do is use the simpler tools, the spot tool and what have you, to just get rid of to a degree. Likewise, over here, we've got a couple of outliers. Can I use the spot tool there? No, it's not quite lined it up. Slightly better. What I might use on these two is actually, I might go to the clone tool. And if now what I do here is I pick this little bit of bar here and I line it up like that. And then I can just, he's gone quite nicely. and then I can maybe just do that. And that's not bad at all. I'm quite happy. We managed to get rid of those two people with the traditional clone tool. We might be able to manage it, certainly with this lad sitting here. Now, if we go up here, slightly more problematic around the top here, but you know what? That's not bad at all. Now, what it has also done is cloned these little bits here. So I've got 3 identical little kind of brown patches. So what I can do with that is I'll take the patch tool, grab a bit of that, and then maybe move it over there. So I've got rid of those little patches. And now it's not obvious that some kind of clone has gone on. So that's got rid of those people there and the people at the back. Now, there is another bit here which says, if we go back to the find distractions, we've got all these people. Now, it said people was an option. So if I click people, let's see what happens. Now, it's selected these people here. It hasn't selected everybody. It's left this guy here. It's left it's got rid of those. There's a little guy over there. But it's got rid of a few of them. So let's hit enter, or yeah, removing area, and see what it does. And it's kind of removed them. Now, how do we go? How does that look compared to? It's not bad. It's filled in, but it hasn't necessarily filled in the way we wanted it to. It's got rid of there's bits of detail behind here that maybe we've lost. So perhaps we want to be slightly more selective with it. At this point, maybe I'm starting to think about the generative fill, because what that will allow us is to have more than one option. So let's go back to here. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use the selection tool. And we're going to take it and I'm going to really paint in. So we'll take the poll of this person. There's a little person over here. And I'm going to try and basically just be a little bit careful. You don't want to do massive amount, because if you're wanting to you want to try and keep as much of the detail in the background as you can. It doesn't matter quite so much over the grass, because the grass isn't going to worry about cloning. But the background, certainly, the computer is going to be looking for the detail that's around where we're selecting off, and it's then going to be filling in according to what's around it. So the more we remove, the less it's got to actually work out what it could be filling it with. So there is a little bit. So I mean, I think if I was doing this really being a bit more, you know, if I was wanting to make a, you know, I was going to be printing this off, I would go in much more closely, take much more time to select each of the individual people. And now we've got that. That's what we're getting rid of. I think if I either need to hit enter. All right, yes, that's right. Now I go to Generative Fill. What would you like to generate? Now, if I just click Generate, hopefully what it's going to do is it's actually going to remove those people and fill in the gaps. But like I say, the great thing now is rather than just using the one-off, like the spot healing or something like that, it's going to give us options. And so now what we should be able to do is look. So we've now managed to get rid of all those people. And what we can do is we can sort of decide which of these. Well, this one's given us a little bit of bush there. Each one has gone slightly different with what it's replacing. So if you look, for example, at the bottom of this carriage here, you can see that looks different in each one. The little railings coming down on that one, slightly more obvious there. Look a bit odd there. Seem to disappear halfway there. So maybe if I do that one, I'll go with that one for the moment. But the point being that I've got choices. And if I wanted, I could just, if I wanted to go again, I can just hit generate again. And it will give me 3 more options. So I can do that as much as I like. Or if I decide I really like what it's done over here, but I don't like that bit, I can reselect another area and then do the generative fill in different places. So again, we've got variations. If I come in here, the smoke here, it's now taken a bit of smoke behind that one as well. So you can see that we've got lots of options here, but to be honest, I think I quite like that one where there was the bushes put into there. So we'll go with that. Now we've got this, we can decide, do we want to still crop it the same way? Now, it does need cropping, I think, but we can put it in, but we can maybe go, if we wanted, a little bit more cinematic. Maybe a little bit more out the front of it, but we can do something like that. So it's given us more options to play around with our crop. So we haven't had to crop out where the pole came down on the left and we have people sticking in. So it's giving us these options. And then at this point, if I copy all that into one layer, then we can go in and do the extra layer of edits where maybe, that's a bit kind of overkill. But maybe I bring the shadows up a little bit, take the highlights down a little bit, maybe add a very slight vignette, maybe play with the contrast a touch, maybe even give it a little bit of clarity, something like that. Bring those shadows up a touch more, I think, and then that allows me to do a little bit more clarity, something like that. And now we've got, and that's brought out the sort of shine on the train as well. So we've gone from that to that, and we've managed to get rid of the people, and it now kind of feels authentic. So hopefully then, Marilyn, that's kind of given you some ideas to play around with, that there's all these different tools, and what you need to do is find the right, it's quite often a mishmash, it's a mix of different tools. So you'll use the spot healing works best for small things where you've got the same background all around it. So removing a bird in the sky, removing a spot on somebody's face, removing a stain on a piece of cloth. Those things tend to work really well for the spot removal tool. The patch tool works better when you want so there's a larger stain, there's a cloud you're wanting to remove, and you can drag in a chunk of texture which is identical from another part of the picture. The remove tool is then coming into, it's making much more kind of bringing in what's around it and things like that. But then sometimes it works mostly but not always, and so then you might need to touch it up using your clone tool or another bit of spot tool, and your generative fill. And your generative fill then gives you the chance of having more than one option, rather than just you click it and it just gives you the one replacement. You've got several versions, and you can keep going until you get the replacement version you like. But always with those ones, you have to remember that the resolution is much lower with generative fill, which is fine if you're only doing a small patch, but if you're going to do a large patch which you need to remove, you're adding like a large chunk of table or whatever, the generative fill might not work with that. Or you might use a generative fill to start with and then start patching in detailed texture from other parts of the picture. So this kind of editing process, yes, people will go, oh well, the computer's done it all for you, you just click the button, but very often it's not click a button once. It's do multiple versions of the editing in order to refine and get the bit that you want. Where are we at? Viji says, technology is exciting as long as you can adapt. When we are closer to 60, we want to go back to the past and all the nostalgia attached to it. Yes, when life wasn't so complicated. Marilyn says, thank you, Kim, that's a huge help. I'm delighted, good. April says, I like it much better. If I was there, I would have said it's not going to work, or go in front of the people. A lot of times people are nice when you have cameras and you look like a photographer. Yes, this is true, but also by the look of it, the scene that Marilyn wanted to get in, she wanted to get, she'd got much closer, and even if she's gone and stood in front of these other photographers, and even if they'd let her, then she might have been too close to it to be able to get the proportions that she wanted. So it kind of depends sometimes, and I think ultimately, as I said, there's two different skills going on here. There's the photographer skill, which is you at the point with the camera, and then there's the editing skill, which is what you can do with the raw material that the camera managed to give you. And if you are into your editing, it's not necessarily that the press the button, Photoshop will do it all for you, makes you a lazy photographer. I think what happens is you learn to combine both. And so what I do so frequently when I take photos is I'm taking the best photo that I can. But at the same time, because of my knowledge of what can be done editing, there are certain times when I'm taking a photo where something's in the way, or there are elements to it that I can't change. I can't do anything about at the point I'm taking the photo. And if it was only about the photography, I might abandon it at that point and go, I can't get a good photo. But knowing what I can do with the editing, I can then go, well, I can take this photo because there's a good chance I'll be able to sort out that bit that's upsetting me about with the photo when I get to the editing. But I'll maybe take a few more photos with the idea of there are extra elements in these other photos that I'm taking which I can then use to help replace and remove the bit that I don't want to be in there. So if I know that there's a pole and it's going to be needed to be replaced by a bit of building behind it, maybe I can move to the left and I can move to the right to take other photos of that building which are going to show up the bit that's being blocked. Now, those other angles aren't giving me the overall composition that I want. The overall composition is coming from the point where the pole is in the way. But the other photos that I've taken, I know I'm going to be able to take strips of to be able to replace the bit later on. So having a knowledge of how to maximize your editing can make a big difference with what you do at the point you're taking the photo. So ultimately, for me, I think photography is the combination of what you do with the camera and what you do with the editing. So, hope that all makes sense. Robert says, I do the same thing, especially with power lines or background elements. And Nick says, me too. Yep, excellent. Okay, so thank you, Marilyn, for sending that in. I think that's really given us an interesting area into the idea of what you can start doing with removing objects. Okay, one last thing I want to do now, because it was supposed to originally just be a feedback session. It's ended up growing into this how to remove objects, but Viji did send me in an image as well, in fact a couple of images to for a little bit of feedback. So Viji sent, let me just where are we? If I tell you what, if I do that and then move over to here. So Viji sent in a couple of images, so let's flick over to here. She said, image submission for this week's critique section, patterns on a wall with moss. And she did two. There's this one here, and then there's a closer up one here. And she says one zoomed in, one zoomed out, another zoomed in. And there's another one where she's got a pattern with trees looking up as well. Different lighting, different perspective. It would be, what would your advice to be to make these more interesting? Well, I think where I wanted to go with these, Viji, is the idea that to a certain extent what you're doing is you're going a bit abstract with this. But it's also to try and decide what is it you were trying to get. And this kind of comes to the core of all photography. And one of the things I keep coming back to, which is at the point you brought the camera up to your eye, what was it that was interesting you? What was it that you thought, oh, I want to try and capture this, either to try and capture it in the camera or to capture it with the idea that I might do something with it in the editing process later. Because too often what we do is we go, that looks kind of interesting, I'll take photos of it and then worry about it later. And then you get back to your computer and you go, well, I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to be doing with it. And that can happen because we didn't really make a conscious decision about what it was we wanted to get in the first place. So the clearer you can be at the point you take the photo, the easier all of subsequent decisions become, whether that's what settings you want to put on your camera or what editing you're going to do afterwards. So what we have, so for example, we have these patterns on the wall. So we've got this kind of stone, but we've also got concrete and we've also got moss. Now there's a number of different reasons why you might have taken this photo. It might be what you really like are the lines that are kicking about, or it might be what you like is the contrast between the texture, the kind of rough texture of the stone, and the kind of smoother or the fluffier texture of the moss. Or it might be a colour thing. What you quite like is the greys of the stone and the concrete and the greens of the moss. And depending on which of these is really grabbing your attention will inform what you do next. So let's take a look. Well, I'll tell you what. We'll take one of these and we'll open this one with Photoshop and play around a little bit with it. So first of all, if we take something like this, is it about the lines? Is it about the contrast? Is it about the colours? Now, if it's about the lines, then maybe what we would do is actually try and create. You might want to you could even revolve it, turn it, and see whether those lines become slightly interesting from a different angle. Because like that, we've got this cutting through here. But quite often, we talk about playing with diagonals. If we do something like that, we end up with this kind of curve sitting here. So we've got a diagonal running, that diagonal is going to the corner, that diagonal is going to the corner, this diagonal is going down to a corner. When you have diagonals running into a corner, it quite often lends a certain energy to the picture. So it might be that you might want to play around with something like that. This is if it's just about the lines. But if it's something else that you've found interesting in the photo, then maybe it's not that. So this is what I mean about the idea of, depending on what's running in your mind, depending on what's trying to grab your attention, is going to make a huge difference as to where you go next. I just want to, let me minimize that. Okay, I wasn't sure whether Viji was going to give me any more hints on that. Doesn't matter. I will run on for the moment. So let's flip back to this. Now, if you're wanting to play, and then it's a case of, so is it about the textures? Is it about the lines? And are you wanting to capture what's there, or are you wanting to go more abstract? Are you wanting to take an idea and then shift it? So if we go back to here, so we've changed the line on it. We've decided to go for that curve. This is just an example. Now, one of the things I noticed about this as well is it's sharper at this end and it's starting to go out of focus at that end. So perhaps there's also a thing when you're taking the photo that if you're wanting to keep the maximum amount of it in focus, then you need to kind of are you shooting straight on so that the depth of field is the same as across as much of the picture as you can. Whereas actually when we take a look at this, what we can see is it's curving around the wall, and so it means that this bit is staying in focus. Oh, there we go, not what I wanted to do. This bit's staying in focus, whereas as we move over to the right, it gets more out of focus because the wall is curving away. Unless you're wanting to make a feature of that notion that it's falling away as well. So again, that might, oh, not that. That might affect what you're going to do. So if we were going to go absolutely, what could we do with this? If we say went to black and white, if it's about tonal range, for example, so let's say I go to gradient map. There's different kinds of gradient map. I can have perceptual, linear, classic, smooth, stripes. Let's go to classic, or let's go to linear, or no, let's go to classic. Okay, and then if I wanted, I could take the curves and I could exaggerate the contrast, and I can play around with something like that. And now it's become much more abstract. We've still got a lot of texture in here. Supposing though we say we wanted to reduce the amount of texture, what I might do is go to black and white. Let's just go to the levels and just drag these up and down a little bit, so we've got a little bit more contrast between the black and the white. I'll select all these, put those onto a fresh layer. Now, what you could do, for example, is if we went to filter and I go to the filter gallery, there's all sorts of things we can play with. Film grain, fresco, but I'm going to go to cutout. And cutout, because cutout will limit the number of colours we've got. And in this case, they've got over, sorry, just bring this in so that you can actually see what's going on. So over here, it's got number of levels, edge simplicity, and edge fidelity. Now, the number of levels is how much of a cutout it goes. I can bring this back, and you see it gets simpler. And if I've got edge simplicity, we can go from very complicated to very simple. I take down the number of levels, And then we've got edge fidelity as well, which is kind of how much detail is on the edge. And if I take that down, right down, you can see it's getting very blocked now. So what we've done here is we've gone from this, which is very detailed, mossy, to this, which is just a set of shapes and lines. And the white is where we've got one of these and we've got that diagonal, but some of it, like the line that came down the middle here, has been lost. The point being here, Viji, is that you can go in that direction, or if you wanted, if we go back to the original here, and maybe it was more about the colour and the texture. If I filter camera raw filter here, because you've taken this in the shade or on a dull day, there isn't the same level of colour. So if I go to colour here, I might boost the saturation, take up the vibrance, and now we're getting much more riches, and the stone behind is becoming really quite blue. Now, it's also, maybe it's overdone at this point, but you can see you can start playing with colour, or you can play with tone, or you can play with shape. So really, it kind of depends on where you're going. And ultimately, I suppose I'm not going to give you a complete answer with this, but it's how you want to play with it. I suppose the same thing then occurs with, if we were to go to your trees, if I open that with Photoshop as well. So you've already, now this is in colour, but it's obviously taken on a dull day. There's a lot of silhouette, so the colour has mostly gone. It's practically black and white. Now you could put that into black and white and just change it, or again you could boost the colour. I mean, if I go to filter, camera raw filter, let's say I took the shadows, bring the shadows up so we're getting a little bit more here, bring that exposure up so we're now getting a bit more of the colour in it. Then I could take the colour and I could boost the vibrance, boost the saturation. Now this is a bit overkill, but now you can see we've got lots of greens, we've got bits of yellow on the trunk. It looks much more like a sunny day. That's going on. Alternatively, I'd cancel that. You could decide that you wanted to take the curves. You know, the brighter we get, the more twigs disappear, the less there is in the screen. The darker we get, the more the sky gets filled in with all the twigs and the brush. So you can kind of use your curves as well to sort of decide how much of the image you want to show. And then you can put it into black and white and you can play around with it. But ultimately, it comes down to this notion of, what were you wanting, Viji? What is it that was grabbing you, and where would you like to take it? And if you're not totally sure, play with some artifacts, play with some contrast, play with light and shadow, and see if you can kind of create something out of it. But always with these things, it's better if you can make a good decision at the point you're taking the photo. It's not to say we do, and it takes practice. You have to kind of get into a habit of it. Our default is just to go click and almost worry about it later. But the more we can get into the habit of just sort of saying to ourselves, oh, that's interesting, click. And if you can, catch yourself and go, okay, even if I say it out loud, what is it I'm finding interesting? Is it about the texture contrast? Is it about the colour? Is it about the smell? Is it about the mood? Is it about the tonal range? What is it I'm finding interesting? And now I actually consciously make that decision to say, this is what I'm finding interesting. That then affects everything else, all the decisions I then make. Well, okay, now I understand really what it's about is I like the contrast of that soft moss against the hard stone. Well, the next photos I'm going to take are going to be about emphasizing that. Or I'm going to take these photos with the idea that I can enhance that in the editing process. And I think that's even more especially true when you're doing sort of abstract or semi-abstract images. What's the abstraction? What's the bit that's grabbing you? Because as soon as you go abstract, it really is down to your personal interpretation. Your idea of what's going to be an interesting abstract is not going to be the same as somebody else's. So it's about finding something inside of you which is making you go, ooh, I find that fascinating. The clearer you can identify that, the easier it is to then take your image and pursue that. So I hope that all makes sense. Okay, Viji says, I understand, Kim, the ridges, it was the ridges and the moss. It would get the ridges and the moss, but is it, so the combination, do you want to really get in with a macro and have that moss right next to the ridge? Or do you want to find a way of contrasting the ridge with the moss? In which case, maybe getting in closer or taking from particular angles, playing around with the angles to really get that contrast is going to be different if you're close up than if you're kind of standing back. So, hope that all makes sense anyway. So there we go. I think that pretty much brings us to the end of the podcast. Don't rush off yet though, because there is something that I want to tell you about. So first of all, thank you very much to Marilyn and thank you to Viji for sending in the images. You both get your bonus 25 smug points for that. That will get added on, which brings us to the end of March. I will work out who's got the most smug points for March, and then they get to choose next month's challenge. My guess is it will probably be Viji at this point, because I think she was on 65, add on the 25, plus another 5 for leaving comments. I think she's overtaking you, Robert, because you didn't put anything this week. However, I will confirm that once I've had a chance to add this together. But the big thing here, the big thing that I want to talk about is next week, because next week is the 5th anniversary of these podcasts. 5 years. 5 years we've been keeping this podcast going. And I've been kind of racking my brains to think what we can do about it. And what I think I would like you to do is I want you to send me, let's celebrate what these podcasts have actually done. Have you benefited? Have you gained from these podcasts? And in what ways? And so there's 2 things I would like from you. You can do one or you can do both. Both would be better. But at least please try and do one. One is send me an image. Okay, send me an image that you feel has been influenced by what you've learnt on the podcasts. It might be that you took this image because you were trying out something that you saw in one of the challenges, or feedback you got from me on an image that you then decided to have another go at doing. Anything like that. But something that you, since you started watching the podcast, whether that was 5 years ago or you just joined us in the last few weeks, find an image that you feel has been influenced by the podcast, which you're really pleased with. Send it to me, tell me about it, tell me why you've chosen this image. And then next week we'll go through and I'll show the photos and we'll have a celebration of that. So that's option number 1. Option number 2, for those who feel like they would like to do it, is to actually tell me what you, again, really kind of like what you get out of the podcast, why you watch the podcasts, what you've gained from them. I mean, yes, the photo, one photo, that's one specific example of. But if there's a bigger picture, or if there's something that you really feel you've gained from these podcasts over the last few years, then let me know. I sit here every week. I have done every week for 5 years, bar a couple of points where I've been ill or we've been off on holiday, giving you this information in the hope that it's going to make a difference. The more feedback I can get that actually says yes, it does, makes me feel better for doing this. It has to be said. But it's not. But it's partly about me. But it's actually about us. It's this community that we have here. So I would like to know that over the past 5 years I've been doing it, even if you've only been watching this for a few weeks, what have you gained from these podcasts? Let me know. Email me. Now where do we go? So kim@kimayres.co.uk. Send me your image, email me, or put it in the Facebook group or the Flickr group. Again, stick an image in, write what you want to write, and try and get this into me midweek, Friday at the latest, because I've got to put this podcast together ready for Sunday. So if you can let me know that, that will be greatly appreciated. And meanwhile as well, there's always buymeacoffee.com /Kim Ayres for anybody who feels like they want to support it that way as well. And so I think that's, and don't forget to do the subscribe, like the video, tell your friends about it, all that kind of thing. So that's it. Please send me your stuff ready for next week's podcast, and I hope you've enjoyed this one. And that's pretty much it, I think. So thank you once again to Viji and to Marilyn for sending in images. Thank you to all of you who've been watching live, and thank you to those of you who are turning up a bit later and watching the recorded version. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care. Bye-bye.